At 11 p.m., the GPS blinked out, the screen going black as if someone had cut the stars from the sky. Ray Sullivan thought it was just another dead battery. He would learn, in the next hour, that the world could go dark for reasons he had never imagined, and that what he called an invader might speak truths he had been taught to dread. If you want truth over comfort, hit subscribe and like. It's your signal you accept this message. The road into Blanco County felt like the unrolled spine of the night, black ribbon between fields, a few farmhouses showing as low, stubborn squares of light. Ray's truck crawled along, diesel thrumming an unreliable rhythm beneath him. He'd taken longer routes for jobs before, but this one should have been straightforward. A downed transformer on a private line, a call-out that paid for 2 weeks of groceries and another month of the apartment. He'd been an electrician long enough to know the hour that would make the difference between a steady account and one that vanished from the ledger. He had bills, obligations he could name like fingernails. He had habits, a worn Leatherman in the left pocket of an oil-stained jacket, a toolbox smelling vaguely of flux and old sweat, a playlist of talk radio that he never let fully drown the silence. Divorce had scaled him down to a man of practical measures. Paperwork said he was single. His heart kept an overdue ledger. There was Michael, his son, 7 years old the last time Ray had held him for more than an hour. The text messages stopped being calls and then stopped entirely. Legal papers did what feelings could not. It was easier, he had learned in church and in bars and in the hard light of pay stubs, to build a firewall of anger around the wound. Anger was righteous, anger protected. And priests and Sunday men had taught a simple geography of spiritual life. Angels of God and the others, fallen, dangerous, a thing to be feared. Ray carried those lessons like a pocket knife. They were sharp, useful, and kept him safe in the dark. So when the first impossible light appeared, blue and pulsing like a heartbeat through fog, Ray swore under his breath and pulled to the shoulder, instincts of caution fastening him more firmly than the seatbelt. The glow was not a halo or a lamppost. It lived in the field on the right, just past a rusted cattle gate. At first it felt mechanical, a flare from someone's emergency rigging. But the way it breathed, inhaling and exhaling light in slow, deliberate waves, made the hairs along his forearms stand up. A low hum reached him through the glass, a frequency you felt more in the sternum than you heard with the ears. The smell before he climbed down from the cab was like burnt ozone and rain that had not fallen. He thought of the transformer and of the job, and did the small arithmetic that keeps men like him moving toward trouble. Tools are useful. He could make money tonight. He could be home for a late breakfast and then sleep in the afternoon. Michael's dentist appointment loomed like debt. He told himself the sensible things as he locked the truck. A weather probe, military training exercises, someone with a generator. But the sensible story and the blue light were different things. The sensible voice was a radio you only half listened to. The field held the object like a sleeping thing. The craft sat low, its skin matte, but punctured by panels and seams that caught the blue in sudden edges. It hovered a few feet above the ground, a shallow dome that hummed. At its midline there was a hatch, opened like a wound, and inside the wound was a cluster of exposed mechanics, sparking and smoking, blue threads of energy leaping between contacts. As he walked, the night tightened around him. The hum amplified into a physical pressure. A breeze picked up and carried a metallic tang that clung to his tongue. The more he looked, the more his knowledge of wiring made the impossible appear fixable in the same instant it left him breathless. Sparks winked with a cadence that set his teeth on edge. When his flashlight beam hit a connector, the metal responded by curling a line of luminous dust away from his light like a shy animal. He had never seen solder mist with color before. The figure that stepped out from the craft was not cinematic. There were no grotesque claws, no long-fingered horror. It was slender and deliberately unthreatening,
tall in a way that never announces itself with movement, only with the space it occupies. Skin was not the right word. It had a membrane that picked up the moonlight and turned it a soft gray blue. Ray's first reaction was not theological. It was practical and small. The thing had hands. They were long, with too many knuckles, but hands nonetheless. Instinct made him back toward the truck. Heat of old training, hand on the holster he did not own, shift into glare and threat, was an armor he could pull up when necessary. But the figure did not move like a threat. It stood, and then it pointed with a steady, deliberate motion toward the open hatch, toward the sparking panel that was bleeding light. A gesture, a request without words. Ray's mouth found words anyway. "You need help?" he asked aloud, the sound of his voice absurd to him in the wilderness. There was no reply in air that he could hear. Instead, the sentence came into his head with the clearness of a thought he had always known. Help, please. Ray's skin prickled. Telepathy was precisely the sort of thing you'd expect from B-movies and late-night forums, not from a rural field in Texas. He reminded himself not to let his mind leap to conclusions that would make him look foolish at the county bar.
He checked his tools greedily with his eyes. Pliers, insulated gloves, his multimeter in its cracked rubber sleeve. A rational man knows when the job is a risk and when the job is a job. He had patched live wires in rain before. He'd coaxed life back into aging breakers. This was a different kind of risk, but the calculus felt familiar. A paid call, a problem, a device you could fix. And then, beneath the steadiness of his practical mind, something else rose. An old spool of fear that had been wound tight in him for years. The teaching he'd sat through in church, the sermons that waxed hot about prowling evil, had left an imprint. Fallen angels had been described to him as prowling spirits, cunning and malignant, capable of ruin. He had been warned about stray demons in lonely places. He had listened and learned prudence through the cadence of warnings. What if the please in his mind was a lure? What if someone had already been swallowed by curiosity and come back in pieces? The stories acted as a leash on his steps. They tightened now. Fear is a subtle teacher. It speaks in the voice of caution, but often instructs withdrawal. Yet compassion, another language he once heard at home before things split, whispered differently. He had a job to do in the world. Keep the lights on, fix what's broken. He'd found, in the slow hours of his work, that fixing the smaller emergencies sometimes stitched the bigger ones in people's lives. This was the thought that moved him forward. There are things in the world that get worse if left unfixed. He crossed the field, the grass wet with the kind of dew that holds sound, and found himself standing before the open hatch. The craft's body hummed a note that ran straight through his bones. The sparking panel was a confused knot of wires. On many of the cables, there was a sheen like frost that didn't melt where his light hit it. His multimeter read things it should not have read, voltages that climbed and receded, frequencies that seemed to breathe. The needle flicked and refused to hold. Sometimes the gauge swung violent, sometimes dead with blank refusal. He set the multimeter down and dug for his tester, the one he'd relied on when meters lied and things needed a human hand. He pulled gloves over his calloused fingers and reached in with the cautious curiosity of someone who had been down in machines before. The panel was not like any relay he'd fixed. It felt thinner, like a membrane stretched over energy, and when he touched metal, it sang faintly in his fingertips. There was motion at his shoulder. The traveler did not step close. It remained still, cataloging him with the attention of a surgeon. The voice in his head, clear, neutral, shifted into a verb. Please. Ray breathed through it, one steady in-breath that was all the faith he had left for this moment. He argued, a litany of rationalizations. Don't be stupid. It's dangerous. It's an opportunity. It could be a hoax. He thought of the boy who did not call him. He thought of his ex-wife's last text, a short affair of legalities and silence. The thought of Michael put a rawness under his anger which often had been the pillow he slept on to avoid the ache underneath. The possibility of doing something practical and maybe righting a strange wrong in the night pulled him more than the sermons pulled him back. His hands worked with the precise automatic motion of men who have worked for years with old machines. He traced the frayed insulation to a break and found copper that flashed like a secret. He wrapped the broken strand around a bolt and set a temporary clamp. Sparks chased the joint. The multimeter spiked, then shivered back as if the machine breathed relief. A small, steady blue light stabilized near the seam. The hum went from an aggressive buzz to something like a purr, less a machine on the verge of death than an animal easing its strain. For a moment, under the open sky, Ray allowed himself a laugh, dry and quick, because repairing things had always been a currency of his worth. Fixing this would be another paycheck on his life. He felt, absurdly, like a priest of an appliance, blessing a body back into function. The traveler shifted. There was a tilt to its head that read like gratitude. In the same silence that had carried the initial plea, a thought arrived not as a sentence, but as a question. Why do you fear us? Ray's fingers tightened on the clamp. Heat rose up his forearms. Instinct drew him back to doctrine, the playlist of warnings drilled into men in pews. He felt the old geometry of spiritual law. Fear equals protection. Wisdom equals flight. Yet the question lodged there, plain as a nail in the wood of the night. Why did he fear? He wanted to know what it would mean if the threat he had been braced against all his life carried a voice that asked him this. Why did he fear? He thought of the sermons and the warnings and the boogeymen whispered in the back of youth group hallways. He thought of his father's silence and his mother's prayers, of the way church had taught threat and vigilance and the habit of naming many things demons. Had those lessons preserved him? Had they kept him away from danger? Or had they kept him from healing? The traveler's next thought unspooled like a thread you could follow. We are bound. Bound. The word traveled in his mind like a small animal fleeing light. Ray's pragmatic brain tried to translate, bound, trapped, imprisoned by something. But before he could arrange the meaning into theology or nightmare, the lights along the edges of the hatch dimmed further, and he noticed the creature's breath, if breath it was. The membrane along its ribs fluttered as if under strain. The hum, which had become a purr, dipped into a faltering whisper. The mechanism at the heart of the hatch thrummed, then faltered, then faltered. Sparks flowered again, brighter and more frantic. Whatever power sustained the craft was failing in a way his hands, trained on copper and iron, could not completely steady. He scavenged from his kit, an insulated splice connector, some heavy-gauge wire, his Leatherman's wire stripper. The multimeter laughed with erratic readings. He improvised, old electrician's magic, stitching across a severed trace, rerouting the feed instead of repairing the damaged node. He wrapped, crimped, and held the wire in place until it took. When he finished, the hum returned, as if in gratitude, rising into a steady tone that matched the rhythm of his pulse. The blue light steadied into a softer glow, and for a moment the craft seemed less object and more organism, breathing in the small night air. Something had changed in him, too, but it was not yet the peace he remembered from church. It was a quiet that smelled faintly of ozone and rain, a clearing after a long road. He could feel the tight line in his chest loosened by a finger's breath. For a second, his hands shook less. The traveler did not speak in language he knew. Its thoughts came as images and simple metaphors. Around the soft edges of the telepathic stream, there was an economy of phrase, intended not to command, but to invite. It showed him, briefly, like a flash, the inside of something that might have once been like a river. Currents, flow, eddies trapped in a basin.
Then an image he could hold, a radio dial slowly sliding off a frequency and getting stuck on static. Ray half smiled despite himself. He knew about frequencies, how in his truck he could sometimes pull in a station with a little nudging, the wheel of the tuner catching the wave for one perfect song before slipping into another. "You're saying it's a bad station?" he muttered aloud to test whether language would hold. The thought that came back was not a lecture, but a patient nudge. Like any signal, we can be bound to the low channels. We draw to what resonates with us. He heard the word resonate and felt a small, dangerous recognition. He thought of the nights he had fed on anger, anger as currency, as refuge. He thought of how that mood pressed down on him, made his world a smaller place. Could his own low hum, the grating drone of resentment and bitterness, be an invitation rather than armor? He wanted to scoff. He wanted the old certainties. Bad things exist. Stay away. Say your prayers. But beneath the scoff, something like curiosity crept in. Could the story he was taught hold truth and be incomplete at the same time? The traveler's next presence was quieter, almost intimate. It did not push an argument. Instead, it offered a question that landed like a stone thrown at glass. If fear calls to you, what do you feed it with? Ray's jaw worked. He had heard similar words in the dozen sermons. Sin feeds sin. Pride begets pride. But in that delivery, there was no sermonizing. There was a tenderness to the inquiry that made the old defenses itch.
The thought seemed to look right at the place in him that had swollen with blame after the divorce, at the echo of the voice that had stopped calling, at the resentments he had stacked like a wall between himself and the boy he loved. He remembered the last conversation with his ex-wife, the clipped legalities, the way she had told him that Michael was better without him. In the months after, he had fed the anger like a small fire. The warmth of blaming had become a furnace he fed daily. The thought from the traveler reframed the scene not as a moral calculus in which he was right or wrong, but as a vibrational one. Words he did not yet have a theology for, but that landed with the bluntness of reality. If fear is a signal, and signals find matching receivers, then perhaps the anger that he had worn as armor was also a beacon. He could have denied the thought. He could have reached for all the sermons about demons that had marked fearful outlines around his life. Instead, he found his palms cold and his throat open in a different way. There was a pain there that wanted something more than a righteous posture. There was a boy named Michael whose name would not leave him. Then the vessel's light shivered. The hum stuttered in a way that sent icicles through his teeth. The traveler's membrane sagged. Ray looked up and realized with the acuity of someone seeing a friend trip. It was weakening, or more precisely, whatever sustained it was thin. His repair had been enough to steady for now, but the damage within the hatch had deeper roots than a broken trace. There were things that needed more than clamps and wire. The traveler's next communication came as an image he could not shake. A cord tied around a tree that was fraying at the fibers. In the mind breath that followed, a short and precise thought arrived. We cannot repair ourselves here. We seek hands that remember how to mend. It was an appeal without pretense. It admitted limitation. God knows the last things Ray expected to hear in a field off a county road were words of humility. But there they were, unadorned. He had a choice. Walk back to the truck, call it in to someone who would take the night and write up a report that would turn into insurance and probably a shrug of disbelief. Or remain and keep working until sweat soaked his jacket. The practical calculus was similar to the moral one. A man in his line often found himself making the strange equation. The longer you help, the more you owe. But this was not simply money owed. There was also the peculiar debt of curiosity that comes when a new question opens in you and there is no obvious authority to consult. He stayed. He worked with a battered hand, the way a man who has carved things with tools for years works. efficiently, with an intimate knowledge of the way metal yields. He opened panels, traced circuits that had no clear schema, and resolved to improvise more than repair. The traveler's next communication came as an image he could not shake. A cord tied around a tree that was fraying at the fibers. In the mind breath that followed, a short and precise thought arrived. We cannot repair ourselves here. We seek hands that remember how to mend. It was an appeal without pretense. It admitted limitation. God knows the last things Ray expected to hear in a field off a county road were words of humility. But there they were, unadorned. He had a choice: walk back to the truck, call it in to someone who would take the night and write up a report that would turn into insurance and probably a shrug of disbelief, or remain and keep working until sweat soaked his jacket. The practical calculus was similar to the moral one. A man in his line often found himself making the strange equation: the longer you help, the more you owe. But this was not simply money owed. There was also the peculiar debt of curiosity that comes when a new question opens in you and there is no obvious authority to consult. He stayed. He worked with a battered hand, the way a man who has carved things with tools for years works. Efficiently, with an intimate knowledge of the way metal yields. He opened panels, traced circuits that had no clear schema, and resolved to improvise more than repair. The traveler watched without intervening, and when Ray fretted over radical measures, grounding odd points to the frame, siphoning through capacitors with ad hoc resistors, it did not flinch. If anything, there was a relaxation in its posture, as if the being had not expected the human to bridge the gulf between species and was grateful beyond the measure of words. At one point, the multimeter blew a fuse in its casing, and sparks scattered like blue confetti. Ray cursed under his breath and ripped back the rubber to expose the inner guts. He found a makeshift rectifier mouthing malfunction, grabbed a piece of copper from his kit, and jury-rigged a conductor. It was messy, and it was right. It smelled of ozone and old solder. The hum steadied. A series of lights along the craft flared, then dimmed like a blink. Ray heard, not with his ears, but in the shudder of his chest, a softness that might have been a laugh. "You're an odd kind of worship," he muttered, not sure if he was scolding the machine or himself. The comment was a small human attempt to anchor absurdity. The traveler sent back a sensation, something like amusement threaded with tiredness. Then, clear as the night air and sharp as flint, a question rose into his mind that was not rhetorical. "What do you want to be free of?" The words landed like a sluice gate opening. Ray had never been asked that in those terms. People asked what he did for a living, what he wanted, whom he loved. No one had asked the precise question of what he wanted to be freed from. The litany of small slights, the ache of loss, the smell of the apartment that held only him and his echoing mornings. His throat closed. He thought of forgiveness, a word trotted out in the language of churches and self-help books alike. Forgiveness had always been a map with fog. Sometimes it looked like reconciliation, sometimes like surrender, sometimes like quiet acceptance. It had never been lined out with the clear practical steps he'd take on a job order. The traveler's thought came with the economy of a technician. Forgive, and you change the resonance you broadcast. Gratitude shifts the antenna you offer. Small practices, it suggested, raise the pitch you vibrate at. This was not an argument with a Bible. It was an observation from a stranger who spoke without a throat. The narrative arc in his head wanted to catalog this as heresy or salvation. Ray felt both impulses. He knew, as a matter of doctrine and caution, that he must not adopt every strange teaching that arrived in a field under alien light. He also knew that insight does not always come dressed in familiar robes. Whatever the traveler would eventually say about angels and the spiritual realm needed to be weighed with discernment. It was an interpretation from an encounter, not a replacement for the scriptural and pastoral teachings that had shaped him. Before he could structure the thought into belief or disbelief, the multimeter read a stable line for the first time since he had arrived. The needle rested halfway, steady as a heartbeat. The husk of the craft pulsed in a rhythm in time with it. The traveler's skin, if you could call it that, had slowed its flutter. Relief rolled through Ray not in a dramatic flood, but as a quiet settling. He felt absurdly like a man who had been allowed to put a gentle hand on a fevered brow. Then, with the steadiness restored, the traveler reached into his mind again and said simply, "Why do you believe that?" The finality of the question lodged like a stone in the place in him labeled memory. He knew what beliefs had shaped him, what Ray had been taught in church, what the barflies and message boards had repeated, what his father had spat in a voice that kept its respectability by virtue of repetition. But staring at the craft's blue light and the creature whose gratitude he had earned by being mundane and brave, he felt the edges of those beliefs blur. The night air cooled. Crickets resumed their distant chorus like a world oblivious to the questions he now carried. The truck parked along the road seemed very far away. He could have climbed back in and driven to the county line and never looked back. He could have called someone to document the oddity, filed a report, and let bureaucratic distance sanctify his safety. Or he could go deeper into the field of questions and let the repair be the first in a long series of acts he did to mend the things inside him. He was not sure what bravery meant in that moment. He only knew that on the inside, the tightness of his chest felt like a wire snugly wrapped but not yet fused. The traveler's last presence that pried at that wire was softer now, almost reverential. "We arrived to learn," it thought. "We are not what you feared." Ray's breath fogged in the night. He reached up instinctively and touched the metal near where he'd made the clamp. It was cool and persuasive under his glove. On the surface, etched into the skin in a line he could not explain, was a faint pattern of rings, concentric, as if something had tried to find a frequency and kept circling the point without quite catching it. The image matched what had been offered earlier, signals getting stuck on low stations. As he stared at that pattern, the telepathic presence narrowed to one small, deliberate question, fired cleanly through the quiet. If fear keeps you listening to the low channels, what would happen if you tuned elsewhere? The blue light pulsed an answer, and then, for the first time since he had stepped into the field, a truth arrived that did not fit cleanly into his boxes of doctrine and fear. It came as a sensation in his chest that was not peace, he would name that later, but a possibility that whatever haunted the edges of his life might be less invincible than the sermons had implied and more susceptible to the small, stubborn acts of a man willing to change the signal he sent. He had fixed a machine, and in fixing it, something inside him clicked in a way he had not anticipated. The hum lilted higher, and with each rise in pitch, he felt thin hope pressed through the old armor. Then, somewhere beneath the hum and the repaired circuits, he heard something else. Not a voice as language, but the beginning of a story yet unfinished. An invitation made of light that would demand he choose again, less on the practical ledger of money and more on the ledger that had to do with his heart. The night stretched, and the traveler's attention turned toward the hatch in a way that suggested movement. The craft was stabilizing, and with movement would come questions he did not yet have the vocabulary to ask. Ray had repaired the immediate wound, but the underlying knot remained. He swallowed against the cold and felt the weight of a choice heavy as the toolbox at his feet. He could walk back to his truck and leave the encounter as an oddity to be filed under things best left unexplained. Or he could stay, listen, and let that strange voice, gentle, patient, unthreatening, pull him into a conversation about things he had been taught to fear. Whatever he chose, the night had changed him.
He could not unsee the blue light or unfeel the way it had matched tempo with his heartbeat. Before he could decide, the traveler's final thought before movement was a single, quiet question that bent around his bones. Do you want to be freed? Ray's hands rested on the toolbox. The question echoed in a place where choices about Michael and about anger and about the small daily practices of gratitude or bitterness had their beginning. He tasted salt on his lips as if he'd been sweating for hours. The craft's lights brightened in a way that suggested readiness to rise, or perhaps to test the next phase of repair. He had patched wiring. He had threaded a temporary solution into alien machinery. Beyond the technical success, something had been unlatched. The rest of the night promised either an explanation that would reshape his private theology, or a refusal that would leave him with nothing more than a story to tell at the bar. Ray did not yet know which. He only knew that the question, "Do you want to be freed?" was a hinge. He had not yet stepped across it. The field around him held its breath. The blue light pulsed, steady and patient, as if waiting for a single word. Ray's mouth opened before his mind had finished deciding how to answer. The word that rose was not elegant. It was the naked one that had been living behind his teeth for years. Yes. The traveler's presence brightened in something like surprise and relief. The hum of the craft shifted upward a half tone, as if a chord had resolved. For the first time since he'd stepped into that strange light, Ray felt an expectation that wasn't wrapped in dread. The question he'd been handed, "Do you want to be freed?" was not a demand. It was an offer to learn, to try a different kind of workmanship, the sort of ordinary courage that had him repairing transformers and coaxing life back into streetlights for a living. Then listen, the traveler thought, and the stream of images and simple propositions that followed had the clarity of instruction and the softness of mercy. It began with the picture of a radio dial. The traveler's mind cast it forward and back like a slow demonstration. You know the tuner, it projected. When it is set low, you receive static or old transmissions. When it is raised, you find clearer stations. Not all stations are good, but some transmit warmth, music, language that helps your heart. We are like that. We occupy ranges. When you vibrate low, you create a reception for what is stuck there. Ray, hands still tasting of ozone and copper, found that he could see the metaphor as if it were laid in sand in front of him. He remembered nights alone in the truck, how anger had been a sharp comfort that kept other pains at bay. He also remembered the silence after a fight with his ex-wife, a silence that was not peace, but a kind of static that turned every empty room into a loud place. Could anger actually be a frequency? It sounded almost too modern to be true, but the analogy landed with a force that felt honest. The traveler's next thought was slower and more tender. It presented to him, in the haptic way of its mind, the image of a pond in still weather. When stones are thrown, it suggested, they make ripples that last longer when the water is cold and trapped. Warmth and movement settle the water more quickly. Forgiveness is a way of moving the water, not by denying the stone, but by choosing how to respond to it. Ray wanted to argue. Forgiveness felt sometimes like surrender. He had been taught in church that forgiveness was a command, and commands can feel like traps when the heart has been burned. But this was not commanding. This was a tradesman's explanation that tied the spiritual to the mundane. Certain energies attract like-minded things. If you stop feeding the small fire of grievance, the smoke lessens. If you add a different element, gratitude, small mercy, the atmosphere changes. Practical steps, he said under his breath, as if organizing an order laced with heat and common sense. The traveler responded with a sequence, not a decree, but a set of invitations that fit the shape of habits Ray could do. First, name it. The traveler suggested that he start with what he grudged. Give the resentment a proper address.
It was presented as a simple task. It was presented as a simple task. Write the names of the injuries on paper, exactly as he remembered them. Not to dwell in bitterness, but to let the list be external, so it could be seen. Ray thought of the voicemail from 3 years back, the slashes of a judge's order, the way Michael's laughter had become unfamiliar. The list trembled in his chest like a tool he was not yet sure how to use. Second, small acts of gratitude. The traveler's mind shifted to smaller images. A cup filled to the brim, a lamp lit at dusk. It advised that gratitude was not a denial of pain, but a reorientation of the antenna. Instead of arguing with the existence of the hurt, one can give thanks for a small thing that is true in the moment. A warm meal, a steady truck, the fact that the boy had once loved him. These were not cures, they were shifts. They were practices any man could do without pretense. Ray had been spared no special revelation here. Anyone could set a plate on the table and be grateful it was full. Third, boundary and responsibility. The traveler was quick to correct any romanticism about forgiveness being only about letting go. Forgiveness did not mean allowing abuse to continue or excusing wrong. The being's mind put a new image, a fence around a garden. You clear the weeds in your yard. You set fences so what's poisonous doesn't come back. Forgiveness does not mean you remove the fence. It means you stop feeding the weeds you can change. Ray felt that line like something sharp and true. He had used anger as a fence in the past, an all-encompassing barrier that did not differentiate between healthy protection and isolation. The idea that forgiveness could exist alongside careful boundaries was novel and strangely freeing. Fourth, small repair rituals. Practices like prayer, quiet, naming what you do not like, and then releasing it in prayer or journaling. An exercise in which one writes what he wishes for his son and then folds the paper and sets it in a place where it can exist outside his clenched fist. The traveler described these not as magic spells, but as tuning increments. Like a dial, it said, you do not change overnight. You move the knob a little. Repeat, alter your environment. At one point, while the traveler's thoughts were moving through these steps, Ray's throat tightened, and for the first time since the field had taken him, he cried. No sound, just the wetness at the eye and the feeling of something letting go. Tears leaked because the list included a line he had been avoiding. Apologize without certainty of reception. You may not be forgiven by the other. You cannot control the other's response. Apology is an act you do to change yourself and the signal you send, not an exchange you can force. The traveler's presence acknowledged the peculiarity of human shame and the risk of vulnerability. We are not theologians, it thought, but we have witnessed patterns. When a being you love is hurt and you hold the hurt like treasure, you feed the low stations. When you offer repair, even if it is not accepted, your own resonance changes. It did not promise reconciliation with Michael. It did not promise a return to family dinners shaded with laughter. It offered something humbler, a shifting within Ray that would change how Ray's nights felt. When he tried to structure all of this against his Christian teaching, the tension returned. The set of ideas, frequencies, resonance, mechanical metaphors, hinged on a premise that felt foreign. That fallen angels, as he'd been taught, might, in the traveler's telling, be better described as spirits stuck on low frequencies. The traveler framed it gently. From our observation, it communicated, sometimes in images and sometimes in concise words, some spirits remain in stagnant patterns. They are drawn to those who vibrate similarly. Fear is one such attractor. At that phrase, old alarms in Ray's chest bristled. He had sat through sermons that spoke of demons as malignant, willful actors actively seeking to sow ruin. That teaching had been protective in many instances. The traveler's phrasing felt dangerously close to minimizing the reality of spiritual warfare. It would be easy to take one witness's account and make it a new doctrine. The traveler anticipated that recoil. Its answer was not a rebuttal, but a caveat. This is what we have seen, in our way of encountering the world, it thought. Interpretation must be careful. Scriptural truth remains. There are malign forces and a creator greater than us. We offer our perspective, that patterns of stagnation exist and that transformation changes the field. Take what helps. Test with prayer and community. Seek wise counsel. The carefulness of that prompt eased some of Ray's unease. The traveler did not seek to replace his faith. It offered an experiential lens that could be tested against his scripture and his pastors. The invitation to discernment felt like a necessary safety valve. "You say fear feeds them," Ray said aloud, quietly, as if speaking would tether his new knowledge into the world. "So what? Stop being afraid?" The reply came not as a blunt order, but as workmanlike instruction. Fear is an energy. It has shape. It will not simply disappear if you will it away. You have to practice different responses until they become the defaults. Breathing, speaking truth, small acts of gratitude, these shift the body and mind. They change the broadcast. He thought of the people at church who told him to just trust in God in the wake of heartbreak. Those were honest words. Trust can be life-saving. But trust is not a single act. It is patient habit. The traveler's approach felt like a blueprint. Adopt routines that tilt your nervous system away from vigilance and toward openness. "Are you saying this is about prayer?" Ray asked, because he needed the familiar to make sense of the new.
Yes, came the reply, simple and immediate. Prayer is a practice. It is a way to reorient. Name what you fear. Speak it aloud. Then name what you are grateful for. Repeat. In that repetition is a tuning. Ray thought of his father muttering the Lord's Prayer on certain nights, of the cheap Bible his ex-wife had kept on the shelf like a talisman more than a book. Those rituals had been full of words he had sometimes found empty. The traveler's framing made the acts feel less pious and more pragmatic, small levers one could use to shape a life. He understood, in a gut-tingling way, that such practices might not resolve all things, but they might change the room he occupied enough that the low hums would not find purchase. Then the conversation turned to something that unsettled him in a new way, the nature of fallen angels. The traveler did not say they don't exist. That would have been reckless and would have violated the cautionary lines it drew itself. Instead, it offered a reframe. Some beings labeled as fallen are what you call stuck. They are not all one thing. Some act maliciously from choice or rebellion. Some act from distortion and a lack of movement. The language of fallen is a way your tradition names a reality. We add, not all immobility is intent. Sometimes it is entropy. Ray's chest tightened. The script of his faith had always been binary in class, angels of God and then the rebellious ones. To hear a nuance in the field of blue light was a disarming thing, like finding a familiar song played in a minor key. It did not upset the entire song, but it shifted his ear. He found himself listening with more curiosity than fear, a small mercy to the being that had asked for help. Does forgiveness help them? He asked, because the logical extension of the new framework suggested that forgiveness could change not only his own resonance, but affect those spirits. The traveler's answer was careful. You cannot forgive for another soul, it projected gently. Forgiveness transforms your broadcast. When your signal changes, you no longer draw what is stuck at the old level. In some cases, when the field changes, those old patterns lose strength and can move. That movement is not your control. It is an invitation. For many beings, release comes through movement that they cannot perform alone. It was a subtle distancing from any magical thinking that would make Ray into a savior for spirits. The traveler refused to make human agency into cosmic dominance. Instead, it offered a humble mechanism. Change yourself. Do not expect to change others directly. The field will respond in ways that are not always visible. At that, Ray's practical mind, the one that could solder and jury-rig and count payrolls, wanted specifics. It wanted to know how to make the change durable. The traveler supplied a sequence that fit a man's habits. First practice, 20 breaths.
He described a breath sequence that Ray could do even in the truck cab in the morning. 3 cycles of deep inhalations and slow, long exhalations. Eyes closed, counting up to 100 in gratitude for small things. 1 to a warm truck seat, 2 to a radio station that plays music, 3 to the neighbor who had once lent a ladder. Those were not fanciful, they were repeatable. They would take seconds, and repeat it would alter the body's chemistry. Second practice, a micro practice of apology. Ray was to imagine a short sentence, "I'm sorry for the hurt I caused," and to say it once silently each morning, not to hope for an answer, but to adjust his tone. The traveler did not promise reconciliation, it promised internal adjustment. Third practice, a public or private act of kindness each week, as small as dropping off a bag of groceries anonymously. Action follows feeling, the being projected. When behavior precedes feeling, the feeling follows faster. The logic appealed to Ray's muscle memory. He had fixed a stranger's wire that night and felt better. Doing acts of repair in people's lives was already in his marrow. Fourth practice, a guard against fear-mongering. The traveler warned that there were those who would commodify fear, sell it as certainty, and instruct people to live in perpetual panic. Discernment is a practice, it thought. Churches can help. Discernment is not an excuse for isolation. Bring what you learn into community. That last word was a needle through a seam in Ray's chest. Community had been what he'd lost. The traveler did not ask him to go back to people who had criticized him. It invited a slow re-entry into trustworthy company. Find one person you trust, it suggested. A pastor, a friend, a brother. Test these things in the light of counsel. At that, Ray's own inner parish register stirred. He remembered the pastor who'd once handed him a casserole when his sister was sick. He remembered nights in the church parking lot where he had cried in a diesel truck and not been judged. The traveler's counsel to seek community spoke straight to a need he had insulated with anger. As the repair of the craft reached a stable hum and the multimeter's needle found a new rhythm, the traveler took a slightly longer tone and told a small yet unsettling anecdote, framed as observation rather than prescription. It described encountering beings in ruins who had been stuck for long spans, not malicious but hollowed by repetition. We find that when a being has been stuck for centuries, it projected, it develops a pattern. It does not always desire harm, it desires sameness. Interaction with a warmed presence can nudge it. That image of sameness as a hunger for stability was something Ray recognized in himself. If you had been hurt, stability may look like anger, because anger is familiar and offers an identity. To be free meant risking the unfamiliar. The traveler read that recognition and did not scold. It offered instead an experimental test, small and time-bound. Try this for 40 days. The suggestion was oddly exact, like a work order. Do the breaths each morning. Do the apology sentence aloud once a day. Do one small act of kindness per week. Record the changes. Ray thought of the discipline like a job assignment. He believed in routine. He could imagine setting his phone alarm at dawn. He could imagine doing the breathing in the cab, in the grocery store parking lot. 40 days was not a magic number. It was long enough for a habit to begin to take root. It also placed limits on disappointment. If nothing changed, at least he tried a practice with intentionality. "Will this protect me from the things everyone's afraid of?" he asked, voice thin as a wire. "Protection is not a guarantee," the traveler replied, with an honesty that kept him from superstition. "It is a reality of alignment. When you change, you alter the reception. You are not invincible, but you may be less attractive to what is stuck." That distinction was essential. It preserved Scripture's reality of danger while offering agency. It allowed Ray to hold both caution and hope without flattening either into easy slogans. As the last of his practical questions dispersed in the air, the traveler offered a final and intimate reflection. Forgiveness and gratitude are not only for those who harmed you. They are for the future you want to inhabit. They alter the soil. That image moved him in a way that was physical. He thought of Michael and the possibility of mornings in which the boy's laughter threaded into his life, not as a memory, but as a present reality. The thought was not a promise. It was an opening. He allowed himself to stand in the possibility for a moment and feel the muscles in his face loosen. Then the craft shifted. The hatch began to close in stages. The hum grew steadier. Ray's hands, still oily from the clamp and the jury-rigged conductor, felt suddenly small and human. He recognized the finish of a job, the quiet pride that settles in a man after work well done. "Will you leave now?" he asked, both a practical and theological question. The traveler's attention returned to the question like a beam. "Yes," it projected, "we will travel. We will continue what we do. But you are changed. The choice you made tonight, repairing, listening, staying, was the action of a person who could become a different signal." The craft rose slowly, a vertical arc that did not so much climb as dissolve a presence into the star-sprinkled night. Its blue light thinned, not with drama, but with the casual efficiency of a machine resuming the course it had interrupted. The field that had held its breath let out a long quiet like a released lung. Ray stood there for a long time after the last blue star slid into the sky, and the hum shrank into distance. The ground was cold through his boots. His palms smelled of metal and cold wire and newness. He recognized the finish of a job, the quiet pride that settles in a man after work well done. "Will you leave now?" he asked, both a practical and theological question. The traveler's attention returned to the question like a beam. "Yes," it projected, "we will travel. We will continue. But you are changed. The choice you made tonight, repairing, listening, staying, was the action of a person who could become a different signal." The craft rose slowly, a vertical arc that did not so much climb as dissolve a presence into the star-sprinkled night. Its blue light thinned, not with drama, but with the casual efficiency of a machine resuming the course it had interrupted. The field that had held its breath let out a long quiet like a released lung. Ray stood there for a long time after the last blue star slid into the sky, and the hum shrank into distance. The ground was cold through his boots. His palms smelled of metal and cold wire and newness. He heard his heartbeat like a tool in his chest. It was steady in a way that had nothing to do with adrenaline. There was, oddly, no thunder of revelation. There was a small warmth of possibility, like a furnace opening after long winter. On his way back to the truck, Ray did not sprint. The road was empty and the sky was full. He slid into the driver's seat and sat with his hands on the wheel. The GPS would not glow. He had learned that it had died earlier. He did not throw the truck into gear and race home. He took his time because the night demanded it. He turned on the radio and found, against the odds, a station playing an old song with a melody that caught in him. He smiled at the coincidence and felt no irony. The drive back felt like a different sort of commute. The world had not changed outwardly. Fences, cornfields, porch lights remained. But Ray moved through it with the sensation of a man carrying a small, warm thing inside his chest.
He thought of the list he had not yet written out, names, injuries, the scattered shards of grief, and he told himself he would do what the traveler suggested. He told himself he would try the breathing. The idea of writing an apology sentence made his throat ache in the best kind of way. When he pulled into his apartment's parking lot, he sat for a long beat under the sodium lights. The building looked as boring as it had the morning he had signed the lease. Nothing had obviously shifted. But he felt different. The furnace of his old anger that had kept him live and guarded felt lowered by an inch or two. He did not imagine the life reknit overnight. Small workmanlike practices did not promise that. They only promised a different orientation. He fished his phone from his pocket, thumb pausing above the home screen. For the first time in years, he opened the old messages and scrolled to a thread he had avoided. There was no dramatic scene. He wrote a few sentences on a note app, the start of the list the traveler had prescribed. One by one, names and slights and memory fragments populated the screen. Missed calls, legal calls, angry words, coffee cup thrown in first year. Each line felt like a small release. He didn't send any of it. He merely created a record that lived outside his head. The act was modest and it was honest. Inside the apartment, the air smelt faintly of the thing he'd left behind. Fried breakfast, a loneliness he had learned to call mine. He made coffee not for sustenance, but because it was a ritual he could anchor to. He sat at the kitchen table with his palms folded and did 3 deep breaths, slowly, exactly as the traveler had advised. He counted 2 things he could be grateful for that day: the bread in his cabinet and the truck that still started. The breath work made a small difference. His shoulders loosened. In the days that followed, Ray held to the practices with an awkward diligence. Breath in the morning, a short internal apology sent like an offering, an act of small kindness once a week. He started with a neighbor's lawn he trimmed without comment. He wrote letters he did not mail, sentences that were full of confession and care. He didn't expect miracles. He expected work. Each ordinary practice left a faint residue of newness. At work, wiring boxes no longer felt merely like tasks. Sometimes, when a breaker came alive with the soft satisfaction of a job properly done, he felt a flicker of the work he'd done under the blue light. The idea that repair had a spiritual echo. He stopped eating his anger like a second breakfast. It did not evaporate. It simply seemed less capable of organizing his life. Rumors circled through his small network of tradesmen. There were whispers of a craft sighting in Blanco County, a blue light, an electrician who'd been seen out in the field. Men at the hardware store speculated: military, prank, or religious portent. Ray listened with the casual distance of one who'd learned the cost of telling certain stories at the bar. He told none of them the full truth. The encounter belonged to him and owned him in ways too private for speculation. A few weeks in, when the 40 days had nearly a fortnight to run, he found himself on the phone with his ex-wife. He called clumsily, haltingly, because the traveler had suggested an act of carriage. He wanted consolidation, not drama. The call was not as he had rehearsed. There were moments of silence where the phones hummed like 2 small islands. He did not demand the restoration of anything. He offered apologies with the same awkward repairman's language he'd used on the craft. "I'm sorry for what I did. I'm working to be better. I don't want to be the kind of man who uses anger as an answer." To his surprise, the voice on the other end cracked, not with joy, but with a tiredness he'd expected. The phone call did not resolve into reunion. It did not end with promises for every Sunday dinner for the next decade. It ended with her saying he could come by next week to pick up a small bag of Michael's old toys he had kept in the garage, and his heartbeat did a small, inexplicable leap. It was not a return, but it was not a refusal either. It was a gap bridged even a millimeter. When he hung up, he sat on his truck's tailgate and let the evening wash around him. He felt something fragile and precious. Not the certainty of a fixed future, but the knowledge that his choices had changed the room. He had not conjured reconciliation. He had only moved his own rigging enough that the possibility of movement had reopened. News of the traveler persisted in other ways. Strange write-ups spun like loose paper. Some framed the experience as visitation. Some made the story into a parable about the future of humanity. Ray paid little attention. The encounter had not been for gossip. It had been a work order in the private carpentry of his heart. He returned to the field 2 weeks after the night of the repair, not out of superstition, but to place the folded list he'd written in the grass where he'd stood. It was a small act, monstrous to some, banal to others. He had never believed in ritual mysticism, but now he appreciated symbols. They were anchors that steadied the hands once used to making mechanical things whole. He buried the folded paper under a stone at the edge of the field, saying the apology without expectation, and asking for help as a craftsman asks another to hold a beam while he screws the last brace in place. The soil accepted the paper like a ledger balanced. The season shifted quietly. The multimeter of his life, on a scale he could not have described scientifically, registered a different sort of steadiness. The needle still hopped sometimes when old triggers were touched. A snide comment at a family event, a text from a man at a bar meant to provoke. But those spikes passed more quickly. The work he had to do to keep the system stable grew less onerous because the system itself had been rewired. He did not attribute this to one night's marvel alone. The traveler's presence had offered a set of habits that, with discipline, had reoriented his life. There were nights when the fear returned with an old familiar hiss. He did not pretend to have outrun it. But when it did, he set the alarm for 3 breaths and then 1 apology sentence. He called a friend. He did not act as if the presence of spiritual danger had evaporated. With new humility, he accepted that vigilance was part of life. But he no longer fed the beast of his own construction. Months later, when he thought of the traveler, his memory had an interesting quality. Instead of the creature being the center of the story, the center had moved inward. The blue light had been the hinge. What mattered now was the manual it had handed him, the set of small practices, and the permission to test them in the light of prayer and community. The traveler's reinterpretation of the fallen did not become his new scripture. Rather, it slotted into his life as an encounter that had the right to be considered and the obligation to be tested. At times, he worried he had been naive. Perhaps he'd simply crafted a new superstition, a different set of rituals to make a life feel bearable. He watched men in bars and sometimes envied the simplicity of their resolve, how they took what soothed and tossed the rest. But he had found something in the repair that was not illusion. It was habit, repeated and honest, that began to change the way he walked through nights. He returned in small, intentional ways to his church. He did not go to find a false absolution. He went to find counsel and to test what he'd learned in a community of people whose wisdom he trusted. He read scripture with a curious mind and asked questions about fear and faith. The pastors he spoke with did not claim the traveler's experience as doctrine. They welcomed his testimony with pastoral caution and an invitation to root his practices in prayer, confession, and communal discernment. In those conversations, the strange language of frequency was translated into the older language of the soul: repentance, renewal, sanctification. The overlap felt good. It felt like the traveler and his church had held hands over the same truth from different sides. One evening, several months after the repair, Ray drove out to the place in the field that now had a small stone mark with the list he'd buried. The sky was the sort of black that made the stars bright, and he sat on the hood of his truck and looked up. No blue lights appeared. The hum of the world was ordinary, governed by crickets and distant traffic. He thought of the traveler's final admonition: test with prayer and community. He thought of the multimeter of his life reading more steady lines. He thought of Michael's toys on his kitchen table and of a text from the boy that read, in a small block of childish letters, "Dad, guess what? I lost my tooth." He laughed out loud in his truck, a sound that surprised him because it carried the relief of a man who had been given a new toolbox. He did not rush to example the future as already rewritten. He did not expect that each old knot would untie itself. He only knew he had learned to set his hands to work in new ways. If the traveler had intended to shake his private theology and fling it open to new metaphors, it succeeded. If it had hoped to unsettle fear, it had. But never did its counsel displace his fidelity. Ray kept in the small chambers of his faith the older songs, God as Maker, Christ as Redeemer, the Scriptures as anchors for testing strange claims. The difference was not in belief so much as in practice. He now had a regimen of small, embodied acts that shifted his heart's reception. When the story of the encounter eventually leaked in ragged forms into gossip and online speculation, Ray made a choice to remain quiet. The encounter had been an apprenticeship in humility. Sensationalism would cheapen the tender and practical things he'd been handed. He refused to make a spectacle of the traveler's words. He did not need to convince anyone. He needed to live them. On a warm morning in late spring, he found himself seated at a small table with a cup of coffee and a list he had written for Michael. It was not a letter to change the past. It was a confession and an invitation. He read the words aloud softly. "I'm sorry for the ways you were hurt because of me. I want to be the man you can count on." He folded the page and put it in an envelope marked "For Michael" and left it on the table where toys lay like spilled stars. He did not know if the boy would read it. He only knew the act had altered him. In the quiet of such mornings, he sometimes imagined the traveler crossing the skies elsewhere, helping beings whose problems were not simply human. He imagined, too, that the world was full of people whose fallen labels had more nuance than any sermon could properly name. He was no prophet. He did not claim to have universal truth. He had an experience that changed him and a set of practices that, in his life, proved to be useful. Before the story closes, as stories do, Ray carried out one last work that felt fitting. He stood again under the spot where the craft had been and hummed a prayer that was both old and new. He prayed the way a man who had hands does, asking for mercy, naming his small truths, promising to hold to new habits. He did so with no certainty about cosmic consequences, only with the resolve of a journeyman. If there was a final lesson the traveler had left embedded in him, it was this: fear is a teacher, but a limited one. It preserves. It also narrows. The remedy the being offered was not magic, but artisanry. Daily practices that raised the pitch of his life and removed his resonance from the places where stagnation nested. That remedy required courage, patience, accountability, and prayerful discernment. It asked of him both humility and responsibility. The blue light never returned to Blanco County. The rumor mills spun their own constellations of fact and fiction. In his pocket, Ray kept the small list he had buried and occasionally took it out to remind himself that progress was not linear and that healing was often a series of small acts of repair. And on the last evening of that long season of small work, he posted a short message online, not to spin a legend, but to offer a simple, honest thing. A testimony about a night, a repair, and a new set of practices that had helped him shift out of the frequency of bitterness. He did not promise miracles. He did not ask for headlines. He asked for discernment and company. "If this speaks to you," he wrote, "test it, pray about it, and bring it into community. If you want to share what you've learned or what you've struggled with, leave a comment below. And if you're looking for practical steps to begin the kind of frequency work Ray discovered, simple breathing, apology prompts, gratitude exercises, there's a pinned link to a short ebook in the description that collects the practices he tried. It's meant as a resource, not a promise. Use it with discernment and in conversation with people you trust. When Ray drove away from the field that last time, the road felt less like a ribbon of darkness and more like a path he'd learned to walk with steady hands. The blue light had revealed something to him that night, an interpretation, a challenge, a set of tools, and he had used them in the only way he knew how, by repairing what he could and tending what he could not yet fix. The rest he left in the hands of his Maker and in the small daily work of living differently.